The life of Pontiac. Welcome. Tonight we are going to talk about Pontiac, in the rolling forests of the Great Lakes region, where the waters stretch like inland seas and the ancient trees stand sentinel over centuries of history. There lived a man whose name would echo through the ages. His story is one of courage, of conflict, of a people fighting to preserve their way of life in a world that was changing faster than the seasons. Tonight, we journey back to the 18th century, to a time when three great powers, the French, the British, and the diverse nations of native peoples, competed for control of a vast and beautiful wilderness. And at the heart of this story stands Pontiac, a leader whose vision and determination would shape the destiny of nations. Let us begin our story in the early years of the 18th century, in the lands surrounding the Great Lakes. This was a world of immense beauty and richness, where crystal waters teemed with fish, where forests stretched as far as the eye could see, and where countless communities of native peoples had made their homes for generations beyond counting. The Odawa, or Ottawa as they were sometimes called, were one of these nations, part of the great Anishinaabe peoples who called these lands home. They were traders, diplomats, and warriors, known throughout the region for their skills in negotiation and their extensive trading networks that connected communities across vast distances. Into this world, sometime around the year 1720, Pontiac was born. The exact date of his birth remains uncertain, lost to the passage of time, as was common for many people of that era whose histories were preserved in oral tradition rather than written records. What we do know is that he was born into the Odawa Nation, likely along the banks of the Detroit River or the Maumee River, in what is now the border region between the United States and Canada. His father was Odawa, and his mother may have been Ojibwe, another of the Anishinaabe peoples, though the historical record on this point remains unclear. What is certain is that young Pontiac grew up in a world where the old ways were still strong, where children learned by watching and doing, where the knowledge of generations was passed down through stories told around winter fires. As a boy, Pontiac would have learned the skills essential to life in the Great Lakes region. He would have learned to paddle a canoe through rushing waters and across vast lakes, to track game through dense forests, to read the signs of weather in the sky and the behavior of animals. He would have learned the art of warfare, for conflict was not unknown among the peoples of the region, though it often took forms quite different from the total wars waged by European powers. He would have learned diplomacy and negotiation, for the Odawa were renowned as middlemen in trade, facilitating exchanges between different nations and communities. And he would have learned the spiritual traditions of his people, the ceremonies and rituals that connected them to the land and to the supernatural world. But Pontiac's youth was also a time of profound change. The world into which he was born was already a world transformed by the presence of Europeans. For more than a century, French traders and missionaries had been establishing themselves in the Great Lakes region. They built trading posts and missions, married into native communities, learned native languages, and participated in native diplomatic protocols. The French presence brought new goods, metal tools, firearms, glass beads, cloth, that became integrated into native life. But it also brought new challenges. European diseases, against which native peoples had no immunity, swept through communities, sometimes reducing populations by half or more. European trade goods created new dependencies, as communities came to rely on metal tools and firearms that they could not manufacture themselves. And European rivalries drew native nations into conflicts not of their own making. The French established a particular kind of relationship with the native peoples of the Great Lakes. Rather than seeking to conquer and settle the land, in the manner that British colonists were doing along the Atlantic coast. The French were primarily interested in trade, especially in furs. This led them to develop what historians have called the middle ground, a set of practices and understandings that allowed French and native peoples to coexist, trade, and cooperate, even as they maintained their distinct identities. The French participated in native diplomatic rituals, gave gifts according to native customs, and often intermarried with native communities. Many of the most important French figures in the region were métis, of mixed French and native heritage, who moved easily between both worlds. By the time Pontiac reached young adulthood in the 1730s and 1740s, he was coming of age in this complex, hybrid world. He would have been fluent in multiple languages, his native Odawa, likely Ojibwe and other Anishinaabe languages, and probably some French. He would have been comfortable with both traditional ways and the new realities of the fur trade economy. And he would have been developing the skills of leadership that would later make him one of the most influential figures in native North America. We know from later accounts that Pontiac was a powerful orator, able to sway councils and inspire warriors with his words. We know that he was a skilled warrior, earning respect through his courage in battle. And we know that he was a keen diplomat, able to navigate the complex political landscape of the Great Lakes region. As Pontiac grew to maturity, the world around him was becoming increasingly unstable. In Europe, France and Britain were locked in a series of conflicts that would eventually be known as the Second Hundred Years' War, a struggle for global dominance that would last from the late 17th century through the final defeat of Napoleon in 1815. These European conflicts inevitably spread to North America, where they were known by different names: King William's War, Queen Anne's War, King George's War. And in the 1750s, what would become the final and most decisive of these conflicts began to unfold. This conflict, known in North America as the French and Indian War, and in Europe as the 7 Years' War, began in 1754 with skirmishes in the Ohio Valley. The British colonies along the Atlantic coast were growing rapidly and pushing westward into territories claimed by France and inhabited by native peoples. The French, seeing their position threatened, built a series of forts to block British expansion. When a young British colonial officer named George Washington attempted to evict the French from one of these forts, the result was a military debacle that helped spark a wider war. In this conflict, Pontiac sided with the French, as did most of the native nations of the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley. This was not simply a matter of French influence or manipulation, as British observers sometimes claimed. Rather, it reflected a calculated assessment of interests. The French, with their relatively small population in North America and their focus on trade rather than settlement, posed less of a threat to native independence than the British colonists, who came by the thousands seeking land to farm. The French treated native peoples as essential allies, participating in their diplomatic rituals and respecting their autonomy. The British, by contrast, often viewed native peoples as obstacles to be removed or subordinated. During the French and Indian War, Pontiac distinguished himself as a war leader. He participated in numerous engagements, including possibly one of the most famous incidents of the war, the ambush of British General Edward Braddock's force in 1755. Braddock, a professional soldier trained in European methods of warfare, marched confidently toward Fort Duquesne with a large force of British regulars and colonial militia. But in the dense forests of Pennsylvania, Braddock's army was ambushed by a much smaller force of French soldiers and native warriors. The British, unable to fight effectively in the forest environment and thrown into confusion when their commander was mortally wounded, were routed with heavy casualties, Whether Pontiac was present at this battle remains a matter of historical debate, but it is certain that he was active in the war and gained considerable prestige as a warrior. As the war progressed, however, it became increasingly clear that France was losing. The British, with their larger population and stronger economy, were able to field larger armies and maintain them in the field despite the vast distances involved. British control of the seas meant that they could reinforce and resupply their forces more effectively than the French. And British gold could purchase native allies, or at least neutrality. By 1760, the French position in North America had collapsed. Quebec fell to British forces in 1759, Montreal in 1760. Though the war would continue in Europe and other parts of the world until 1763, French power in North America was effectively broken. For Pontiac and other native leaders, the British victory was deeply troubling. The French had been allies and trading partners for generations. The British were largely unknown, and what was known of them was not encouraging. British colonists had a reputation for insatiable hunger for land. British officials often displayed arrogance and contempt toward native peoples, and there were disturbing signs of what British rule might mean. When British forces took control of French forts in the Great Lakes region, they discontinued the French practice of regular gift-giving. To native peoples, this was not simply a matter of economics, but of diplomacy and respect. In native diplomatic tradition, gifts were how relationships were maintained and renewed. The British refusal to give gifts was thus seen as a sign that they did not value their relationship with native peoples or recognize them as independent nations worthy of respect. Moreover, the British proved less willing than the French to regulate their colonists. French authorities, few in number and dependent on native allies, had generally prevented French settlers from encroaching on native lands. British authorities, facing pressure from thousands of land-hungry colonists, proved either unable or unwilling to do the same. Despite a royal proclamation in 1763 that theoretically prohibited settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, British colonists continued to push into the Ohio Valley and beyond, establishing farms and settlements on lands that native peoples had never ceded. In this context of uncertainty and growing concern, Pontiac emerged as a leader of unusual vision and capability. By the early 1760s, he had established himself as a prominent war chief among the Odawa, living in a village near Fort Detroit, the most important British post in the Great Lakes region. But Pontiac's influence extended far beyond his own community. Through a combination of personal charisma, military reputation, and diplomatic skill, he was able to forge relationships with leaders of many different nations: Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Wyandot, Shawnee, Delaware, Seneca, and others. This was no simple task, for these were independent peoples with their own interests and histories, sometimes including conflicts with one another. What gave Pontiac's diplomatic efforts particular urgency was the emergence of a spiritual movement that swept through native communities in the early 1760s. This movement was inspired by a Delaware prophet named Neolin, who preached a message of cultural renewal and resistance to British encroachment. According to Neolin's visions, the Master of Life had become angry with native peoples for adopting European ways and becoming dependent on European goods. To restore harmony and prosperity, native peoples needed to return to traditional ways, reject European practices and goods, and drive the British from their lands. Neolin's message resonated deeply in communities that were struggling with the disruptions brought by the British conquest and the changes in trade relationships. Pontiac adopted elements of Neolin's message, but adapted them to his own purposes. While he shared the prophet's concern about British encroachment and the need for native unity, He was pragmatic enough to recognize that complete rejection of all things European was neither possible nor desirable. His people depended on firearms for hunting and defense, on metal tools for daily work. Instead, Pontiac focused on the political aspects of Nyaland's message, the need for native unity in the face of the British threat. He began traveling extensively, meeting with leaders of different nations, urging them to set aside their differences and work together to resist British expansion. By the spring of 1763, Pontiac had forged a remarkable alliance. Through councils and careful diplomacy, he had convinced leaders of numerous nations to coordinate their actions in a simultaneous assault on British forts throughout the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley. This was an unprecedented level of coordination among native peoples who had traditionally operated independently. It reflected both the gravity of the threat they faced and the force of Pontiac's personality and vision. The plan was bold and sophisticated. Rather than attempting to confront British forces in open battle, where European military technology and discipline gave them an advantage, Pontiac and his allies would employ surprise and siege tactics. Small parties of warriors would approach individual forts under pretense of trade or diplomacy, then suddenly attack, overwhelming the small garrisons before they could mount an effective defense. Larger British posts that could not be taken by surprise would be besieged and starved into submission. The coordinated nature of the assault would prevent the British from concentrating their forces and would demonstrate the unity and determination of the native alliance. The uprising began in May 1763, and its initial success was stunning. Within weeks, native forces had captured or destroyed nearly every British fort in the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley. Fort Sandusky, Fort St. Joseph, Fort Miami, Fort Ouiatenon, Fort Michilimackinac, Fort Venango, Fort Le Boeuf, Fort Presque Isle, one after another, these outposts fell. At Fort Michilimackinac, Ojibwe warriors staged a game of lacrosse outside the fort, then suddenly rushed through the open gates, overwhelming the garrison. At other forts, warriors gained entry under pretense of trade or councils, then turned on the unsuspecting soldiers. The coordination and tactical sophistication of these attacks demonstrated that this was not a spontaneous uprising, but a carefully planned military campaign. However, the two most important British posts in the region, Fort Detroit and Fort Pitt, proved more difficult targets. These were larger, better defended installations that could not be taken by surprise. It was at Fort Detroit that Pontiac personally took command, beginning a siege that would last for months and become one of the most famous episodes of what came to be called Pontiac's War. Fort Detroit was a substantial fortification on the Detroit River, defended by a garrison of about 120 British soldiers under the command of Major Henry Gladwin. Pontiac's initial plan was to gain entry to the fort through deception. On May 7, 1763, he arrived with about 50 warriors, supposedly for a council with Gladwin. The plan was for Pontiac to give a signal during the council, at which point his warriors would draw concealed weapons and seize control of the fort, killing or capturing the garrison. However, Gladwin had been warned of the plot. The source of his intelligence remains uncertain, though tradition holds that it was a young native woman who revealed the plan. When Pontiac arrived at the fort, he found the garrison on full alert, soldiers standing with weapons ready. Seeing that surprise was lost, Pontiac withdrew without attacking. Undeterred by the failure of his stratagem, Pontiac laid siege to the fort. Hundreds of warriors from multiple nations, Odawa, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Wyandot, and others, surrounded the fortification, preventing anyone from entering or leaving. They fired on soldiers who exposed themselves on the walls, attacked work parties that ventured outside, and captured or killed British traders and settlers in the surrounding area. The siege was not a continuous assault, but rather a blockade punctuated by raids and skirmishes. Warriors would attack when opportunities presented themselves, then melt back into the surrounding forest. This style of warfare played to native strengths in mobility and marksmanship, while avoiding direct confrontation with British artillery and disciplined volleys. The siege of Fort Detroit became a test of endurance for both sides. The British garrison, though well supplied initially, faced the prospect of slow starvation if the siege continued indefinitely. They were also isolated, cut off from communication with other British posts. Morale was low, and there were concerns about the loyalty of the French inhabitants of Detroit, who outnumbered the British garrison and had lived peacefully with the native peoples for generations. Major Gladwin had to maintain constant vigilance, never knowing when or where an attack might come. For Pontiac and his allies, maintaining the siege also posed challenges. While the initial enthusiasm for the war was high, sustaining a military campaign over months required resources and commitment. Warriors needed to hunt to feed their families, plant crops, and attend to other necessities of life. As spring turned to summer and summer to autumn, some began to drift away, returning to their communities. Moreover, the hoped-for French support never materialized. Many of the French inhabitants of Detroit sympathized with the native cause, and some provided supplies and intelligence. But France had formally ceded Canada to Britain in the Treaty of Paris, signed in February 1763, though news of the treaty did not reach the Great Lakes region until later. Without French military support, the native alliance was on its own against British power. Throughout the siege, Pontiac demonstrated remarkable leadership abilities. He held together an alliance of multiple nations, each with its own traditions and leaders. He organized supplies, coordinated attacks, and maintained discipline among warriors who were not accustomed to prolonged campaigns. He also engaged in psychological warfare, sending messages to Gladwin that emphasized the hopelessness of the British position and the unity of the native alliance. In one famous letter, dictated to a French scribe since Pontiac could not write, he informed Gladwin that the French king had sent a message urging the native peoples to drive the British from their lands. This was not true, but it reflected Pontiac's understanding of the importance of morale and perception in warfare. The siege saw several significant engagements. On May 28th, a British supply convoy was ambushed at Point Paley, resulting in the loss of valuable supplies and the death or capture of dozens of British soldiers and boatmen. This was a significant tactical success for Pontiac's forces, demonstrating their ability to project power beyond the immediate vicinity of the fort. On July 29th, another battle occurred at Bloody Run, a small stream near the fort. A British force attempting to destroy native camps was ambushed, suffering heavy casualties. The stream ran red with blood, giving it its grim name. This victory boosted native morale and demonstrated the tactical skill of Pontiac's warriors. However, as summer turned to autumn, the strategic situation began to shift. In August, a British relief force fought its way to Fort Detroit, bringing supplies and reinforcements. Though Pontiac's warriors inflicted casualties on this force at the Battle of Bushy Run, they could not prevent it from reaching its destination. The arrival of these reinforcements broke the isolation of the garrison and demonstrated that the British were not going to abandon their posts. Moreover, as the campaigning season drew to a close and warriors needed to return to their communities to prepare for winter, maintaining the siege became increasingly difficult. In late October 1763, after nearly 6 months of siege, Pontiac received devastating news. A message arrived from a French officer confirming that France had indeed ceded Canada to Britain and would not be sending military support. This was a crushing blow to the Native alliance, which had hoped that French assistance might turn the tide of the war. Without French support, the prospect of ultimate victory seemed remote. On October 31st, Pontiac sent a message to Gladwin proposing a ceasefire. The siege of Fort Detroit was over, but although the siege of Detroit had ended, Pontiac's war was far from over. Throughout the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley, Native warriors continued to resist British authority. Settlements were attacked, supply convoys ambushed, isolated trading posts destroyed. The British response was savage. British commanders, frustrated by their inability to bring Native warriors to decisive battle and horrified by reports of atrocities against settlers and soldiers, authorized tactics that would be considered war crimes by modern standards. There were attempts to spread smallpox among Native populations by distributing infected blankets. Villages were burned and crops destroyed in an effort to starve communities into submission. Prisoners were sometimes killed rather than held for exchange. The war dragged on through 1764, though with decreasing intensity. British military expeditions penetrated deep into Native territory, destroying villages and demonstrating that even the heart of Native lands was no longer safe. At the same time, British officials recognized that purely military solutions were unlikely to bring lasting peace. They needed to address the grievances that had sparked the uprising in the first place. This led to a shift in British policy, including stricter regulation of trade, efforts to prevent colonial encroachment on native lands, and a return to the practice of gift-giving in diplomatic relations. Throughout this period, Pontiac remained a significant figure, though his role was changing. He had demonstrated that native peoples could unite and mount a formidable resistance to British power. He had forced the British to treat native concerns seriously and to moderate their policies. But he had not achieved his ultimate goal of driving the British from the region. As a realist, he began to recognize that some accommodation with British power was necessary. In 1765, Pontiac participated in preliminary peace negotiations with British officials. These negotiations were complex and often contentious, reflecting the deep distrust on both sides. British officials wanted assurances that the uprising was over and that native peoples would cease attacks on settlements and trading parties. Native leaders wanted guarantees that their lands would be protected from settlement and that they would be treated with respect. The negotiations were complicated by the fact that there was no central native authority that could speak for all the different nations involved in the war. Each nation had its own leaders and its own interests, and all had to be consulted. The following year, in July 1766, Pontiac traveled to Fort Ontario on Lake Ontario to participate in formal peace negotiations with Sir William Johnson, the British Superintendent of Indian Affairs for the Northern District. Johnson was an unusual figure in colonial America, an Irishman who had made his fortune in the fur trade, married into the Mohawk Nation, and developed a deep understanding of native cultures and diplomacy. He spoke several native languages and participated in native ceremonies, earning a level of trust and respect that few British officials enjoyed. The council at Fort Ontario brought together representatives of many nations. Over several days of speeches, ceremonies, and negotiations, the outlines of a peace settlement were worked out. Pontiac agreed to cease hostilities and to urge other native leaders to do the same. In return, Johnson promised that native lands would be protected from settlement, that trade would be regulated fairly, and that the British would respect native autonomy. The agreement was formalized with the exchange of wampum belts, symbolic objects that recorded agreements in native diplomatic tradition. Pontiac's signature on the treaty, a drawing of an otter, his personal symbol, marked the formal end of the war that bore his name. But peace on paper did not immediately translate to peace on the ground. Many native warriors, particularly younger men who had distinguished themselves in battle, were reluctant to accept what they saw as a surrender. Some continued to raid British settlements and traders, viewing Pontiac's agreement as a personal decision that did not bind them. Among Pontiac's own people, there was controversy about his decision to negotiate with the British. Some saw him as a traitor who had abandoned the fight. Others understood that he was being pragmatic, accepting that continued warfare could only lead to further suffering. Pontiac's post-war years were difficult. He had been a great war leader, able to unite diverse peoples in common cause. But in peacetime, his influence waned. Native political structures were generally decentralized, with leadership dependent on personal prestige and the willingness of others to follow. A war chief's authority was largely limited to wartime. In peacetime, civil chiefs and council elders held more influence. Moreover, Pontiac's accommodation with the British alienated some of his former supporters, while British officials, having secured peace, felt less need to court his favor. There are accounts from this period of Pontiac visiting various British posts, sometimes receiving supplies or gifts in recognition of his role as a peacemaker, sometimes asking for support or assistance. These encounters suggest a man who was still trying to navigate between the native and British worlds, to maintain his relevance and to secure advantages for his people. But they also suggest a certain diminishment from his wartime prominence, a leader who was no longer at the center of events. In 1768 or 1769, the sources are not entirely clear on the date, Pontiac traveled to Cahokia, a French trading village on the Mississippi River in what is now Illinois. He was far from his home territory, in a region where he was less well known. On April 20th, 1769, Pontiac was struck from behind and killed by a young Peoria warrior. The circumstances of his death remain somewhat mysterious. Some accounts suggest that he was assassinated at the instigation of British traders who saw him as a continuing threat. Others suggest that his killing was related to intertribal conflicts or personal grudges. What is certain is that one of the most significant Native American leaders of the 18th century died far from home, killed not in battle, but by a single assassin's blow. Pontiac's death reportedly sparked a cycle of revenge killings. The Illinois Confederacy, of which the Peoria were a part, faced retaliation from Pontiac's allies. Over the following years, the Illinois peoples were severely weakened by these conflicts, their population declining and their political influence diminishing. In a sense, Pontiac's death had consequences that extended well beyond his own life, reshaping the political landscape of the Mississippi Valley. What, then, was Pontiac's legacy? In the immediate aftermath of his war, some British observers saw him as a savage rebel who had foolishly challenged British power. But as time passed and tensions between Britain and its American colonies grew, some began to see Pontiac in a different light, as a freedom fighter who had resisted British tyranny. In the early 19th century, as American expansion pushed ever further westward and conflicts with native peoples intensified, Pontiac became a symbol of noble resistance, featured in novels, poems, and histories. The most famous of these literary treatments was a 2-volume history by Francis Parkman, published in 1851, titled History of the Conspiracy of Pontiac. Parkman's work, though based on extensive research, was also deeply influenced by the prejudices and assumptions of his time. He portrayed Pontiac as a kind of native Napoleon, a military genius whose talents raised him above his supposedly inferior race. This romantic but ultimately condescending portrayal shaped popular understanding of Pontiac for generations, making him famous but also reducing his complex reality to a set of stereotypes. Modern historians have worked to recover a more nuanced understanding of Pontiac and his era. They have emphasized that Pontiac's war was not simply the work of one man, but rather a broad-based movement involving many leaders and many nations. They have highlighted the legitimate grievances that sparked the uprising: British arrogance, the discontinuation of gift-giving, encroachment on native lands, and the breakdown of the diplomatic protocols that had governed relations in the French era. They have noted that the war, despite its ultimate failure to drive the British from the region, did succeed in forcing British authorities to modify their policies and to take native concerns more seriously. Pontiac's legacy can be seen in several ways. First, he demonstrated that native peoples, despite their political fragmentation and relatively small populations, could mount sophisticated military campaigns and pose serious challenges to European colonial powers. The siege of Fort Detroit and the coordinated attacks on British posts throughout the region showed strategic thinking and tactical skill that earned grudging respect even from British military professionals. Second, Pontiac showed that it was possible, if only temporarily, to overcome the divisions among different native nations and forge a broad alliance. This was no simple achievement, given the diversity of native peoples, their different languages and cultures, and their histories of conflict with one another. The fact that Pontiac could convince leaders of nations that had sometimes fought each other to instead unite against a common enemy demonstrated remarkable diplomatic skill and force of personality. Third, Pontiac's war had real political consequences. The British Royal Proclamation of 1763, which theoretically prohibited colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, was partly a response to the uprising. Though this proclamation was widely ignored by colonists and poorly enforced by British authorities, it represented an acknowledgement that native peoples had legitimate rights to their lands and could not simply be pushed aside. The proclamation became a source of tension between the British government and its American colonists, contributing to the growing alienation that would eventually lead to the American Revolution. Fourth, Pontiac's career illuminates the complex dynamics of 18th-century North America, a world where multiple powers, European and native, competed, negotiated, and sometimes cooperated in a constantly shifting landscape. His ability to navigate this world, to speak multiple languages both literally and figuratively, to understand and manipulate the interests of different parties, shows that native leaders were sophisticated political actors, not simply victims of European expansion. Finally, Pontiac's story is ultimately a tragic one, illustrating the impossible position in which native peoples found themselves in the colonial era. They could resist European expansion, and sometimes resist successfully for a time. But the demographic and technological advantages of the European powers meant that, in the long run, native independence could not be preserved. Pontiac fought to protect his people's way of life and their lands, but within a generation of his death, those lands would be overrun by American settlers, and his people would be pushed ever further west or confined to small reservations. Yet there is something in Pontiac's story that transcends the historical details of 18th-century colonial conflicts. It is a story about the struggle for freedom and self-determination, about the efforts of a people to preserve their way of life in the face of overwhelming external pressure. It is a story about leadership and courage, about the ability of one person to inspire others and to shape events. And it is a story about the tragic consequences of colonialism, about the human cost of expansion and conquest. In modern times, Pontiac has been remembered in various ways. The city of Pontiac, Michigan, founded in 1818, was named in his honor, as were various other places and institutions. The Pontiac automobile, manufactured by General Motors from 1926 to 2010, bore his name, its hood ornament, depicting a Native American chief. These commemorations, well-intentioned though they may have been, often reduced Pontiac to a symbol, divorcing him from his historical reality. The real Pontiac was not a generic Indian chief, but a specific person who lived in a specific time and place, who faced specific challenges and made specific choices. Among Native peoples, Pontiac's legacy is complex. He is remembered as a great warrior and leader who fought to protect native lands and sovereignty. But his story is also a reminder of the immense challenges that Native peoples faced and continue to face in dealing with the consequences of colonialism. The issues that Pontiac grappled with: how to preserve Native culture and autonomy while adapting to changed circumstances, how to unite diverse peoples in common cause, how to negotiate with more powerful adversaries, remain relevant to Native communities today. As we consider Pontiac's life from our vantage point more than 250 years after his death, several themes emerge. One is the agency of Native peoples in shaping their own history. For too long, historical accounts portrayed Native peoples as passive victims of European expansion, swept aside by the inevitable march of civilization. Pontiac's story reminds us that Native peoples actively shaped events, made strategic decisions, and influenced the course of colonial history. They were not simply obstacles to be overcome, but actors with their own goals and strategies. Another theme is the importance of understanding historical context. Pontiac's actions cannot be properly understood outside the context of the massive disruptions caused by European colonialism, the demographic catastrophe of epidemic disease, the economic disruptions of the fur trade, the political upheavals caused by European wars and shifting alliances. His war was not an irrational act of savagery, as some contemporaries portrayed it, but a rational response to genuine threats and grievances. A third theme is the complexity of leadership and decision-making in times of crisis. Pontiac faced impossible choices. He could accommodate British power and hope for the best, risking the continued erosion of Native autonomy and the loss of native lands. Or he could resist, risking devastating military retaliation and the destruction of Native communities. He chose resistance, and though his war ultimately failed to achieve its main objectives, it did succeed in demonstrating Native resolve and in forcing the British to moderate their policies, at least temporarily. The challenges that Pontiac faced, how to preserve identity and autonomy in the face of external pressure, how to adapt to change while maintaining core values, how to unite diverse groups in common cause, are challenges that resonate far beyond the specific context of 18th century North America. They are challenges that all peoples have faced at various times in history, and that many continue to face today. In the forests and lakes of the Great Lakes region today, there are few physical reminders of Pontiac. No monuments mark the sites of the battles he fought. His village has long since vanished, and even the location of his grave is unknown. But his legacy lives on in the historical memory of the region, in the ongoing struggles of Native peoples for sovereignty and justice, and in the broader human story of resistance to oppression and the fight for freedom. As we reflect on Pontiac's life, we are reminded of the fragility of peace, the cost of conflict, and the courage required to stand up for one's beliefs and one's people. We are reminded that history is made not just by the great empires and their armies, but also by individuals who, in moments of crisis, find within themselves the courage and vision to lead. We are reminded that the past is not simply a collection of facts and dates, but a tapestry of human experiences, hopes, fears, triumphs, and tragedies. Pontiac lived in a time of great upheaval, when old certainties were being swept away and the future was unclear. He responded to these challenges with courage, intelligence, and determination. He was not perfect, no human is, but he was undoubtedly significant, a leader who shaped the course of events in his time and whose actions had consequences that extended far beyond his own life. In the end, Pontiac's story is a human story. It is about a man who loved his people and his land, who saw both threatened by forces beyond his control, and who did what he could to protect them. It is about the choices we make when faced with impossible situations, about the costs of those choices, and about the courage required to act when the outcome is uncertain. It is about leadership and loyalty, about war and peace, about the meeting of cultures and the clash of empires. As night falls and our story draws to a close, we leave Pontiac in the realm of memory and history. His world is gone, transformed beyond recognition by the centuries that have passed since his death. The vast forests have been cleared, the wild game depleted, the native nations pushed to the margins of the land they once dominated. The changes that Pontiac fought against, the tide of settlement and transformation that he tried to resist, rolled over the Great Lakes region as surely as the waves roll across those inland seas. Yet in some ways, the questions that Pontiac grappled with remain with us. How do we preserve what we value in the face of powerful forces of change? How do we maintain our identity and autonomy while adapting to new realities? How do we unite in common cause across lines of difference? These are questions that every generation must answer for itself, and there are no easy answers. What we can learn from Pontiac is the importance of courage and conviction, of standing up for what we believe is right even when the odds are against us. We can learn about the value of unity in the face of common threats, about the power of leadership and vision. We can learn about the complexity of history, about how the past shapes the present in ways both obvious and subtle. And we can learn about the human capacity for both great nobility and great tragedy, for both heroism and loss. Pontiac was born into a world that was already changing, and he spent his life trying to navigate those changes, to protect his people and preserve their way of life. He had successes and failures, moments of triumph and moments of despair. In the end, he could not stop the tide of history, but he could and did influence its course. He demonstrated that native peoples were not passive victims, but active agents in their own history. He showed that resistance was possible, that native unity could be achieved, and that native concerns had to be taken seriously by colonial powers. As we conclude our journey through Pontiac's life, we might think of him not as a distant historical figure, but as a human being, much like ourselves, someone with hopes and fears, loves and loyalties, strengths and weaknesses. He lived in a different time and faced different challenges, but the basic human experiences of his life, the desire to protect one's community, the struggle to make sense of a changing world, the search for meaning and purpose, are experiences we can all understand. The Great Lakes region today is vastly different from the world Pontiac knew. Cities and farms cover lands that were once forests. Highways and bridges span waters that were once crossed only by canoe. The native peoples who once dominated the region are now a small minority in their ancestral lands. Yet the spirit of Pontiac, his courage, his determination, his vision of native unity and resistance to oppression, lives on. It lives on in the ongoing struggles of Native peoples for justice and recognition. It lives on in the historical memory of a remarkable man who dared to challenge an empire. And it lives on in the broader human story of the struggle for freedom and dignity. Tonight, we have walked with Pontiac through the forests of his youth, stood with him in council as he forged alliances, fought alongside him in the siege of Fort Detroit, and accompanied him in his final journey to a distant land where he met his end. We have seen him as a warrior and a diplomat, as a leader and a man. We have tried to understand his world, his choices, and his legacy. And in doing so, we have connected with a piece of our shared human past, with a story that, though set in a specific time and place, speaks to universal themes of struggle, resistance, and the human spirit. As you prepare for sleep tonight, perhaps you might think of those forests around the Great Lakes, of the waters stretching to the horizon, of the peoples who made their lives there for countless generations before European contact. Perhaps you might think of Pontiac, the war leader who tried to protect that world and those people. Perhaps you might think about the courage it takes to stand up for what you believe, the wisdom needed to navigate complex situations, and the tragedy that sometimes accompanies even the noblest efforts. History is not just about learning facts and dates. It is about connecting with the human experiences of the past, about understanding how people lived and what they valued, about seeing both the similarities and the differences between their world and ours. Pontiac's story gives us that connection. It takes us to a different time and place, introduces us to a remarkable individual, and invites us to think about important questions about justice, power, resistance, and change. The night is growing late, and our story is complete. We have traveled together through Pontiac's life, from his birth in an Odawa village to his death in a distant land, from his youth in a world still dominated by native peoples to his maturity in a world increasingly shaped by European power. We have seen him rise to leadership, forge an unprecedented alliance, challenge an empire, and ultimately fall short of his goals. We have seen him as history saw him, as a great leader, a formidable warrior, a skilled diplomat, and a man caught between worlds. But more than that, we have tried to see him as a human being, with all the complexity that entails. Not a saint or a villain, not a hero or a savage, but a man who faced difficult choices and did his best to navigate them. A man who loved his people and his land and fought to protect them. A man who experienced both triumph and tragedy, who achieved great things and also fell short. A man who, in the end, was overtaken by forces larger than himself, but who nevertheless left his mark on history. As we close this chapter, we honor Pontiac's memory not with uncritical adulation, but with honest recognition of his achievements and his limitations, his successes and his failures. We honor him as a significant figure in the history of Native North America, as a leader who tried to preserve Native independence and sovereignty in the face of overwhelming pressure. We honor him as a person who lived bravely and died tragically, whose life encapsulates both the nobility and the tragedy of the Native experience in colonial North America. And so, as the night deepens and silence falls, we bid farewell to Pontiac. We return from the 18th century to our own time, from the forests of the Great Lakes to wherever we find ourselves tonight. But we carry with us the memory of his story, the lessons of his life, and perhaps a deeper understanding of the complex history that has shaped our world. We carry with us the knowledge that history is made by people, by their choices, their actions, their courage, and their failures. And we carry with us a reminder that the past is never truly past, that it continues to shape our present and will shape our future. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life of Pontiac. May you sleep well tonight, and may the story we have shared together bring you both peace and insight. Good night.